but it's not quite currently on the mainland. It will be at some point because it's associated with the IVB, which is, you know, widespread now across the UK. And then we've got the Sitaris, the one on the bottom right, that orange-shouldered blister beetle, which, you know, is one that's associated with the hairy-footed flower bee, which is quite a common solitary bee in gardens. And, you know, around Salisbury is kind of a key location really for this species, and it seems to be on the increase in parts of southern England at the moment. So just one to be aware of. But what we're really kind of focusing on today really are the true oil beetles, those typical sort of oil beetles. And why they're called oil beetles is essentially because when they're threatened, they exude like an oily substance from their joints. And this is basically just a deterrent really to deter predators. So it's like foul tasting as an irritant. And, you know, the Americans refer to oil beetles as blister beetles because this oily substance can cause blistering of the skin. So it is a bit of an irritant. I've never really noticed it being a major irritant on our sort of UK species, but, you know, this oily substance is generally just to deter predators. So when you do sort of disturb them, there is a possibility they might exude little sort of bits of oil from their joints like they are in this picture here. And this oily substance is quite an interesting, I suppose, thing because it contains a compound called cantharidin, which is quite attractive really to a number of different insects. So what you quite often see is sort of lots and lots of sort of biting midges over oil beetles. So you've got the oil beetle on the left there that is covered in these little biting midges. And what they're trying to do is access that oil in order to take this cantharidin compound that's present in the oil, and the midges are trying to take it into their body, presumably as a sort of form of defense that might protect them, I suppose, from being eaten by other things because they make them sort of foul tasting. So even if you come across dead oil beetles, you quite often see these little biting midges around their bodies. And also cardinal beetles as well have a bit of an association with oil beetles because they like to take up this cantharidin compound. And actually the female cardinal beetles will only mate with males that have got the provider with sort of good quantities of cantharidin. And here you've got like a male then on the right there, on the right picture, a male sort of riding and sort of biting the oil beetle, trying to take up this oil in order to get this cantharidin that will make him obviously more attractive to females. And I should say that this sort of observation is sort of fairly rarely observed, I suppose, and not very often that people see it, but, you know, now and again you do come across, you know, every few years somebody has sort of seen this in action, which is quite amazing. But in terms of the life cycle of oil beetles, I think this is where the fascination really comes in. I think oil beetles are some of our most fascinating insects, and their life cycle effectively starts really with the adults emerging, and they'll emerge in spring or autumn, depending on what sort of species they are. When they first emerge, like the image on the left shows that, you know, their abdomen barely sort of extends beyond the wing cases. You know, the wing cases are, you know, sort of quite large and the abdomen is sort of hidden underneath. But then within about 24 hours of feeding, then our abdomen sort of swells up and they end up like the picture on the right there with that typical oil beetle shape. So when you do come across oil beetles that are newly emerged, you know, the reason you know they're newly emerged is because, you know, their abdomen isn't fully sort of developed. So though they're not technically growing, you know, oil beetles are some of like the few insects that appear to grow as adults because they emerge smaller, and then as they feed, then their abdomen swells and they get up to a sort of a greater length than they were previously. Some of them like more important food plants for the adults include things like lesser celandines, soft grasses. They'll feed on a variety of different soft grasses. Dandelions can be really important, both the leaves and the petals. Buttercups, you know, really valuable things. Again, the buttercups is what they quite often like with them. Hawkbits as well are, you know, quite important plants. There tends to be very much an association with yellow plants, particularly for the triangulate stage that we're going to come on to in a sec. But they do tend to really like these sort of yellow plants, like the buttercups, like the dandelions, like the celandines, and the hawkbits and all those sort of other dandelion-like plants. So once they've emerged and they fed, then you get the courtship and the mating. So here you've got a mating pair of violet oil beetles. And I can't say I know in depth as to how long they mate for and what everything that's involved. But once they have mated, then the goal of the female then is really to lay her eggs. And she wants to obviously lay as many eggs as she possibly can before she dies. And this is where I suppose oil beetles come into contact with people more, because they're looking for areas of bare ground and quite often compacted ground in order to excavate their burrows, in order to lay their eggs. So they quite often gravitate towards footpaths. So you've got the nice sort of bare compacted soil where people are walking over, you know, a meadow, for instance. And these are then ideal places then for the oil beetle in order to excavate its burrow. So you've got a black oil beetle pictured here that's digging a burrow. And then you can see the eggs then on the right there that are very, very small. And they're in large, you know, quite large clutches. And it's said, though I can't find the reference for it, but it's said that they lay about sort of 10,000 eggs. But I'm not sure if that's true, because I don't kind of know where that figure come from. But the idea is they do lay a lot of eggs. And these eggs then hatch either within a few weeks, in the case of some species, or in a sort of calendar year for other species, into the first stage of the beetle's life cycle that we call the triungulids. So the triungulids are these sort of long-legged, louse-like sort of stages. So they're quite unusual, I suppose, compared to most beetle stages, because the first stage really, and most of the stages of beetles tend to be more like grub-like, you know, they're sort of not very active. They haven't really got obvious legs. But in sort of oil beetles, the first stage is very active and they've got long legs. And as you can see here, very, very louse-like. And all of our sort of UK species have got distinctive triungulids. And I touched on earlier that we've got 8 UK species of these true oil beetles, but 3 of those are actually believed to be extinct. So that's left us with 5. And 5 species are here. So the larger species in terms of the triungulids are the violet oil beetle. So that's Mellow violaceus. And they have typically sort of black triungulids. So the second image across from the left there is the typical sort of black coloring of the violet oil beetle triungulid. So when you see the black version, then it's quite obvious that it's the violet oil beetle. But unfortunately, they do come in a sort of yellowy orange form as well, which then sort of causes confusion really with the black oil beetle, Mellow proscarabeus, who has this orangey colored triungulate, so the third image across. But typically the violet oil beetle triungulids are slightly earlier in the year, and they're a tiny bit larger as well, though it is kind of rather subtle because the violet oil beetle triungulids are 2 to 2.5 millimeters long. The black oil beetle triungulids are 1.5 millimeters long. And then our sort of more interesting species in terms of their sort of rarity, then our rugged oil beetle, our short-necked oil beetle, and our Mediterranean oil beetle have all got very small triungulids. So, but you can see each of the species is kind of distinctive, I suppose. Perhaps, you know, the orange form of the violet and, you know, the black oil beetle, perhaps less obvious because they're both orange. But you can see, you know, the rugged oil beetle is quite distinctive because it's got a bit of a black head, and then the first segment is a little bit sort of dark as well, and then it's got the paler body. The short-necked oil beetle, the next one across, then is sort of dark brown all over, and then the Mediterranean then is a sort of all yellowy orange one, but it's quite a bit smaller than the other orangey species as well. But you know, these triungulids are small. The rugged oil beetle triungulids are only 0.5 millimeter long. You know, the short-necked oil beetles again only 0.5 millimeter long, and then your Mediterraneans 0.8 millimeters long. So you know, these are readily missed, I suppose. You know, quite often they going about their business undetected. It's only when you get large clusters of them, particularly of the violet oil beetle triungulids, because they're black, that you really kind of notice them. But it's, you know, this is really just to emphasize you can identify the triungulids even though they are small. And these triungulids, the reason that they're sort of very active and they got, you know, the long legs is because their main goal really is to find their way up onto flowers. So once they hatch from the ground, then they try to find the nearest flowers and they all clamber up and they assemble on top of the flowers. So you've got a picture on the right there, you've got violet old beetle triangulates, which are the nice black color, and there you can see them all clustering sort of on that dandelion there. And the idea is the reason that they're gathering up on these flowers is because they want to attach themselves to bees, because oil beetles are nest parasites of solitary bees. So what they do is they have little special claws at the front of their legs, which is what the little red arrow points to there on that diagram. And what they do is they hang around on the flowers. When a solitary bee visits the flower in order to gather pollen and nectar it needs to obviously feed its own young, then the little triangulates will grab hold of the body hair and hopefully hitch a ride back to the nest. So with that image on the left there, you've got a sandpit mining bee, and then you've got a number of violet oil beetles that are tucked in the back of the thorax there. And quite often they find their way, well, basically on parts of the bodies that the bee finds it hard to get them off, really. So they're trying to get in those hard to reach places, because the bees are not dull and they know when triangulates are on their body and they will try to brush them off. So they try to go in these sort of really hard to reach locations that the bee will sort of really struggle to push them off. So it tends to be the back of the abdomen, between the abdomen and the thorax, and then also sort of around the side and sort of underneath the abdomen, underneath the thorax as well, just anywhere that's a little bit more awkward. Once, if they're lucky really to get on a female solitary bee and is, everything they kind of really need, then once they get back to the nest, then they'll undergo a bit of a transformation. So they'll go from stage A of this diagram here, which is a triangulate, through to then your typical beetle grub, your B, C, and D, and they'll just feed on the pollen and nectar stores that are in the bee's nest that the bee obviously intended to provide for her own offspring. And then eventually then they'll eat through all the pollen and nectar stores and then become an adult old beetle, obviously the following year emerge, and then the whole life cycle starts again. So here you've got another, obviously, triangulate. So this is actually a rugged old beetle triangulate. So it's 0.5 millimeter long, and you can see it's just on the side of the thorax here of a box-headed blood bee. So you can see where they sort of hide around, and they probably, they could well be other ones at the back there as well. But this is obviously them doing what they do, hitching around. But unfortunately, they don't always get it right. And this really is why they lay so many eggs, because I don't kind of know how many actually make it to adulthood, but it's probably quite a slim proportion actually make it, because they do have a tendency to grab hold of anything that really visits the flower. So that could be, bumblebee, it could be male solitary bees that are obviously not going into a nest. It could be solitary wasps in this case. It could be all manner of other things as well. But here you've got one of the mason wasps, and then there are a number of black old beetle triangulates, the orangey coloured ones there on the side of the thorax there. So, these ones are obviously destined to the doom, really. These are not going to develop to anything, because, of course, wasps feed their young on other animals. So that's obviously not what they want, because they want the pollen and nectar stores. So they don't always get it right. But, just because there's so many triangulates, of course, some of them do actually make it to adulthood and give us the old beetles that we kind of see and what we're kind of talking about today then. So we've got our sort of 5 remaining species, because 3 have gone extinct. And these are really split then between your daytime spring active species and your nocturnal autumn and winter active species. So we have 3 daytime spring active species, and they are the black oil beetle, which tends to be our most common UK oil beetle. We have the violet oil beetle, which is the second most common, really, but is a little bit less common, a bit more restricted to the west of Britain. Then you have the short-necked oil beetle, which is a very rare species, but is found actually around sort of Wiltshire. And then you have your sort of 3 nocturnal autumn-winter species, then, which are your rugged oil beetle, which is obviously the focus of today, and also your Mediterranean oil beetle as well. So we're just going to kind of go through each of these, talk about their sort of key habitats when they're active, how to identify them, all that sort of stuff. And then we'll come on to rugged oil beetle in a little bit more detail after that then. So just to start with the black oil beetle. So this is Mellow Proscarabeus. The adults are active in the daytime. They're active in spring. If it's quite a mild sort of winter, I suppose, they'll be active in February. This year they were active on the 1st of February, and I think they were about that time on the year before as well. So it's becoming almost earlier and earlier every year. But I say generally it's sort of late February they kind of start, and then they kind of grow through then to about June, with probably say April, May sort of time becoming more around the peaks, and then they sort of tail off then into June. They're found in meadows, so they can be found, well inland, but in the southwest England, Wales in particular, they're very coastal as well. So coastal grasslands, when you're walking along coast paths, these are typically the old beetles you generally come across. They're large, so they grow, they're up to sort of 3 centimeters in length, so they're quite large in terms of our British beetles. In terms of their identification, like a key feature really is that they've got this square-shaped thorax. So that middle segment of the body is square. So it's square in 3 of our species and then rectangular in 2 of our species. So even just kind of looking at the thorax will be enough to kind of whittle it down as to, basically the number of species you're going to see. The males have got kinked antennae. So what you find with these black old beetles, the same with violet, is really easy to sex them because the females just have a slight bend in their antennae. So you can might just about make it out, but the antennae go up and then there's a slight little bend in them. In the males, there's a very obvious bend because one of the segments is a slightly different shape to the others, and it kind of all throws them out at a sort of a different sort of angle. So it's quite a bit like a 90-degree bend in the males, and you might see that in some of the later photos. And with the black old beetles, the triangulates hatch within a few weeks of being laid, and they are active then on flowers in June and July. So the triangulates of these are orange. I did mention that the violet old beetle triangulates are also orange, but the violet old beetle triangulates tend to be active earlier in the year, and they're not active in sort of June and July time. So that can be, the time of year can be quite useful for, separating those two. Typical habitat, as I mentioned, is coastal grasslands, but you can also find them inland as well. But you can see kind of typical old beetle habitat, I suppose, on the southwest of England here, Prawl, nice flower rich, soft rock cliffs. There'll be lots of, solitary bees nesting and so forth. There'll be coastal footpaths going behind these, behind these soft rock cliffs, where, things will be, there'll be flowers and opportunity for the old beetles and, to lay their eggs and stuff like that in the footpaths, these are ideal sort of locations. And you've got your map on the right then that kind of just shows the records of black old beetle from iRecord. So there could well be other records out there, but this is just what's available on iRecord. And it just kind of shows the distribution really. So it's very much a species quite typical of southwest England and Wales, but then there are, certainly, other locations for them all across, I suppose, England rather patchily, right away up into Scotland as well. But it tends to be quite rare in Scotland, and the violet old beetle is the most common species of the two up there. But it tends to be our most common species in England and Wales. Then coming on to the violet old beetle, and I'll talk about identification in a sec. But these again are daytime spring active species. They're active a little bit later than the black old beetle. So we don't often sort of start getting records until March, and quite often down in the southwest of England are those earlier sort of records down Cornwall and Devon. And these are active between March and June, so a sort of similar time period. Again, you can find them in meadows inland. Again, you can also find them on the coast, but perhaps less so. Generally, I always think of these as being sort of more woodland edge species. So you sort of get them along sunny sort of woodland edges, woodland rides, things like that with lots of celandines. It's quite typical habitat for violet old beetle. And they have a very western distribution. So the further east you go, the harder it is to find them. And they've probably been lost from some parts of very sort of eastern England already. But they got that square-shaped thorax like the black old beetle. The males have got the kinked antennae. And with these then, whereas the black old beetle, their triangulates hatch within a few weeks of the eggs being laid. With these, the eggs take nearly a year to hatch. So the triangulates are active in spring alongside the adults. So when you see adults active in spring, the triangulates will also be present on flowers around them, but those triangulates would have actually been offspring of the previous year's Oil Beetles. So they do take that whole year to emerge, which is quite incredible. And this is very much like typical violet Old Beetle habitat. So, a footpath, going through a very sort of sunny woodland. And it's hard to see in a picture, but there are lots of sun lines at this site, for instance. So there's lots of opportunities really for the Old Beetles to find their way onto, well, the triangulates to find their way onto the bees. And then on the right there, you've got your distribution map. So you can see it's just as widespread, I suppose, as the black Old Beetle, except that it is very much more to the west. So it's very much a species of southwest England, Wales, parts of northern England, and then mostly then sort of northern, well, Midlands, I suppose, of Scotland, the Highlands and further north. You will see that there's an obvious absence of violet Old Beetle in sort of Kent, East Anglia, that sort of far east of England, as well as much of the Midlands as well. So it has this very much as western distribution. And one of the greatest challenges really of Old Beetle identification is separating black and violet, which is a little bit frustrating because they're our most common species and the ones that people are most likely to encounter. But I suppose once you get familiar with the ID features, they're actually quite straightforward. But they can be quite superficially similar when you're first starting out. So you've got a black Old Beetle on the left there. You've got a violet Old Beetle on the right. I will say now that the color is not always reliable, but as a general rule, the black Old Beetle does have a black body with sort of violet colored legs and sort of violet colored antennae. And then the violet Old Beetle has a generally just violet body all over. But then there are exceptions. You get some violet Old Beetles that are bronze, and you can get some that are black as well. So it doesn't always work. But as a general rule, most of the Old Beetles that you see, they do match the colors they're supposed to match. It's quite useful. So if you're seeing a black Old Beetle with violety legs, it's more than likely going to be a black Old Beetle. If you're seeing a violet colored Old Beetle, it's more than likely going to be a violet Old Beetle. But the kind of key features you are really looking for are on the thorax. So you're looking at, again, that middle sort of segment of the body. And they're both square shaped in these species. But what you'll see is in the black Old Beetle, the punctures are larger and deeper. In the violet Old Beetle, they're sort of smaller, more finer. So that's one useful characteristic. And that applies to punctures on the head as well. But you kind of look really at the back end of the thorax. So in the violet Old Beetle, it has a bit of a V shape. In the black Old Beetle, it tends to be straighter. Sometimes it's perfectly straight. Sometimes it's slightly indented. It's never sort of obviously V-shaped. But it can be quite a difficult thing to make out sometimes. What the violet Old Beetle has, it has this tuft below the thorax. So there's an obvious tuft there, if you can make it out on that photo, kind of where my pointer is going to now. So the big obvious tuft at the back of the thorax there is nice and distinctive for violet. You don't get this tuft in the black Old Beetle, so there's like nothing sort of in this bit of a gap, I suppose, behind the thorax. And then another thing then to note then is that on the violet is almost like it has sort of bite marks at the back. So it's sort of V-shaped, and it has these little indentations at the back there, like something's taken a bite at it, or almost like as though it's been stapled. There's a staple there and a staple there. So if you staple something, almost like there's pinch marks. So that's a very useful identification feature as well for the violet, which you don't get in the black, which is a little bit difficult to tell on this, but quite often they might have a little bit of a ridge going across and it just slopes down, but there's never like obvious indentations at the back. Sometimes you've got to just look on the right angle in order to really see this. So if you capture a violet Old Beetle and have a look at it sort of like slightly side on, you'll kind of see the depressions, those little bite marks at the back of the thorax a little bit more obvious. I think there are, in these next photos, you can kind of see that a little bit more. So in this picture at the top left there, so you can see those indentations with little, almost like bite marks at the back, a little bit more clearly from this angle here. And you can see that obvious stuff at the back there as well. So, so they're quite useful identification features. And then a bit more of a straighter edge to the thorax then on the black Old Beetle. No obvious tuft below it as well. You can see how the punctures are a lot sort of deeper, I suppose, on the black Oil Beetle than they are on the violet, which tend to be a lot smaller and shallower punctures. So with a little bit of practice, once you've seen both sides of the coin, I suppose, once you've seen black Oil Beetles and violet Oil Beetles, then I think it's quite straightforward then. But it's always worth taking a picture and just double checking, just to make sure you're not looking at one or the other. And then, so black and violet tend to be the most common species you're likely to see. Then we've got our other daytime spring active species, which is the short-necked Oil Beetle, Mellow Previcolis. And this is a very rare species. It's active then from about late March to June, probably peaks around sort of mid-May-ish time. It has a very western distribution, which I'll come on to in a sec. But it's associated with a number of different habitats, particularly sort of coastal grasslands, sand dunes, coastal heath as well. I think coastal chalk grassland as well, because I'm sure there are records on Salisbury Plain. But yeah, it's in quite a diverse range of habitats. It's quite a small species, so up to about 2.4 sort of centimeters in length once its abdomen is sort of fully expanded. And it has this rectangular shaped thorax. So whereas the previous two species had a nice square shaped thorax, this has got this rectangular shape. So, it's much wider than it is sort of long. They're sort of very different, I suppose, from all of our other Oil Beetles in that they're small in size, but they're very shiny. They have like a blue-black color to them. You can almost think of them, they kind of look like sort of shiny sheep drop-ins. So, that sort of like color. They've got these really short but straight antennae, so almost like little bead-like antennae. They don't have sort of any kinks in the antennae, so it's not easy to sex them when you've got male or female. And with these then, the trianglids are active in June and July. But this is basically the distribution of the short-necked Oil Beetle. So the lighter green areas show where it has been recorded previously. The darker green areas is where it's known from currently. So it's known from around 6 or possibly 7 sites across Britain and Ireland. So it's a very, very rare species. Your sort of nearest one will be Allington there. And then there's a population down on the Bulbury Down in Devon. And then there's a recently discovered population in South Wales in Pembrokeshire. Then you've got a population on the east coast of Ireland, and then you've got your populations then up in Scotland then on Coll and Barra as well. But this is a very, very rare species. It was believed to be extinct in Britain until it was rediscovered in 2006 by John Walters. And yeah, we sort of added a few extra sites really since then. But it's just a seriously rare thing. But the adults of these are typically sort of found feeding on hawkbits. That's what they tend to feed on at Bulbury Down. And then the trianglids are typically found on those sort of same flowers as well. So that might be a particularly important food plant for both the trianglids and the adult Oil Beetles as well. But yeah, here you can see the short-necked Oil Beetle. So it's quite a distinctive Oil Beetle, small bead-like antennae, rectangular shaped thorax, blue, black, shiny body. But then it's worth noting as to how small these can be. So your textbook examples will go up to sort of 2.4 centimeters. But of course, when they do vary a bit in size, and you will get smaller individuals when they first emerge, they tend to be a lot smaller as well. And what you've got with the image on the right there is an image that Bruce Taylor took up in Scotland this year. That just kind of shows it next to a 5p piece, just to give you an idea of just how small, some of these Oil Beetles can be. So you kind of really got to get your eye in sometimes for spotting them. And then coming on to our rugged Oil Beetle now. So this is the one obviously we want to focus on more today, and hopefully some of you will be going out and doing surveys with Michael and others, this winter. But this is our nocturnal. They're autumn and winter active, so they're active from around late September. So I'm not aware of any records now, but they should be any time now, basically. And then they'll be active then right the way through to about early April. I suppose they mainly sort of peak before, up to about Christmas time. and then sort of tail off a little bit after that. Those sort of January and February, because they'll be really good times to find them. They're found in chalk and limestone grassland areas, but if there are gardens, in those locations as well, then they'll also be found there. But they are very much a species that's restricted to parts of southern England and southeast Wales, where you've got these natural outcrops really of chalk and limestone. And they're a very small species, so up to about 1.9 centimeters in length. They have a rectangular shaped thorax again, so very much like the short-necked old beetle. And they have this distinct groove, really narrow groove that runs down the middle of the thorax, which is useful to separate them from Mediterranean old beetle. And I'll show you the difference between them in a sec. But they've got this roughened sort of texture to their body, so very roughened wing cases, which is what gives them their name, that rugged old beetle. So they're very distinctive in that sense. They're very different from all other old beetles, apart from the Mediterranean, which looks very similar. But they're relatively recognizable. And again, they've kind of got that short sort of straight antennae, very much bead-like, so very much like the short neck there. Don't have the kinks in the antennae for the males, so not easy to sex them, but otherwise quite a distinctive species because of their roughened body, rectangular shaped thorax and small size, and the habitat they're in as well. So very much, a typical habitat are all of those nice, chalk and limestone grasslands. So you're thinking of places like, the Cotswolds, for instance. So, there's lots of areas around Stroud, for instance, that are really good for rugged old beetle, where you've got those, very nice chalk grasslands. But then, there's plenty of those, examples in Wiltshire as well. So there's got to be probably more populations to find out there. The map on the right there shows the distribution of short-necked of rugged old beetle, So you can see that it's very much a species of southern England and southeast Wales. The main core really is kind of around the sort of Cotswolds area, and then sort of spilling into southeast Wales. And then you have some outliers then in other parts of Wiltshire, for instance. There's been quite a few new populations found on the Mendip Hills in the last sort of year or so. It is generally a very under-recorded species, so there's probably far more sites out there for it than we recognize, and that's because it's nocturnal and it's active in autumn and winter. So you've got to ask basically people to go out looking for it that time of year. So you can sort of see why it's generally under-recorded, because entomologists generally don't go out recording really in the dark in autumn and winter. Simple as that. And then the Mediterranean old beetle is the final species really, and this is probably our rarest oil beetle across the UK. It's active at the same time period as the rugged oil beetle. It's found in coastal grasslands, so it's restricted to the southern coastline of England. It's only known from sites in Devon and Sussex. It's quite a large species, so it can get up to about 3.6 centimeters in length, so significantly bigger than the rugged oil beetle. But a number of our UK examples, I suppose, are much more around the similar size of the rugged old beetle. So the size alone doesn't always work. Again, they have that rectangular shaped thorax, but quite importantly, they don't tend to have that groove that goes through the middle of the thorax that you get in the rugged. So that can be a useful thing to sort of having a look at that thorax. It's a kind of key thing to make sure you're not looking at, a Mediterranean when, you could be looking at rugged or so on and so forth. So just bear that in mind, really. Again, they have the roughened sort of wing cases. So very much like the rugged in that sense. They have the straight antennae, bead-like antennae again. So otherwise very similar to the rugged. So it's size really and location. If you're on the coast of southern England, that's where you really got to be mindful of the Mediterranean. And that groove that I was talking about there, so this basically shows the groove. So you've got the rugged on the left there with that very narrow groove that runs through the middle of the thorax, and then your Mediterranean on the right there that hasn't got that groove through the middle. So that's quite a useful identification feature. And this is the size difference when you've got those nice large sort of adults of the Mediterranean on the left there next to your rugged old beetle adults. So, size can be useful, but of course, very rare you're going to have the two species side by side on the same site in order to get that size comparison. And then in terms of sex in old beetles, so I mentioned that with the black and the violet old beetle, the males have got the strong kinks in the antennae, which is useful for sexing them. But the short-necked old beetles, the rugged old beetle, and the Mediterranean have all got the straight antennae. So that's where if you want to sex them and work out if they're male or female, you've got to look at the underside of their abdomen. You're looking at basically the very tip of the abdomen on the underside, and you're looking really at that final segment, a very tip of the abdomen, and sort of looking at the shape of it really. So in the male is generally sort of more curved on the outer edge with a bit of a notch in it. And then in the female, then it's not as curved. So it sort of comes up, goes straight for a bit, and then comes back down, and it hasn't got an obvious notch in it. So very subtle things, but if you really wanted to sex any rugged old beetles you come across, you could sort of turn them upside down and sort of have a look at this feature. And it does work on other old beetles as well. So it will work on the black and the violets as well. But it's just, I suppose, worth noting really that it can cause stress. So I sort of avoid sort of handle them if possible. And it's only kind of really if you really genuinely think there is a really need to work out how many males and females you're looking at. But quite often just knowing that there's a rugged old beetle and where it is enough information. So now we sort of look through all of the species. We just kind of want to then talk about how to go about finding them. And in particular, how we go about finding the rugged old beetle then. So there are kind of two main ways to find old beetles. We can either look for the adults, so we can have a look for them when they're out nest building, for instance, or feeding or mating, and when they go into their lives, or we can look for the triungulates. So look for them on the flowers is another way to do it as well. So with the rugged old beetle, most people record this species by doing surveys for the adults. So in order to survey for the adults, then you need to be going out then in autumn and winter. You need to be going out really from late September or between the period of late September to early April. October, November, December, January, Feb are all kind of pretty good months, really. I'd say kind of earlier I suppose autumn is probably the best, really, before we start to get a lot of those hard frosts. So numbers do tend to dwindle a little bit as we kind of get into sort of January and February, just because that tends to be the sort of the coldest part of the winter. They are most easily found really by searching sort of south-facing slopes of calcareous grassland after dusk using a torch. But then due to the small size, because they often under two centimeters, some are a lot smaller than that, they're really easily overlooked. So you're going to be really careful when you're looking, and really careful not to step on them as well. So that's something to be mindful of. So got to walk really slowly, paying really careful attention to the ground, scanning for these small little beetles. The best sort of conditions really are in dry, overcast and mild conditions. So the beetles don't want to be out in really freezing conditions. Generally, what we found is through a lot of surveys that have gone on in the Cotswolds as part of the Back from the Brink project, that sort of temperatures above sort of 4 degrees Celsius are generally sort of best, and you want to avoid any frosty nights really, because you're going to really struggle to find old beetles then. So you want to avoid those really cold conditions. So where you've got nice sort of mild nights in autumn and winter are really the times to get out. Rain isn't too much of an issue. It's more of an issue for you as recorders really, if you don't want to really be out in the rain. Light rain is all right. Wouldn't really want to go out in sort of heavy rain. I doubt the beetles would want to be out in heavy rain either. So light rain is probably okay, but generally I'd say aim for sort of dryish nights that are sort of nice and mild. The adults can be found on the ground then, usually fairly close to footpaths, because that's where you've got the nice compacted ground in order to lay their eggs. And what we sort of found really in the Cotswolds is that grass tussocks can be quite important for the adults. So as you can imagine in winter, as they're nocturnal, they need to hide away in the day. And when you've got really cold temperatures and there's frost, they also need to hide away as well. So we believe that they're going into grass tussocks in order to protect themselves from the frost, but also to hide away in the day as well. There has been a bit of a tendency in the really cold, times of winter to find more adult old beetles in more tussocky areas or closer to tussocky areas than in more open grasslands. So that's something to bear in mind when you're going out and doing the surveys as well. It'd be really useful if you sort of see this when you're out surveying yourself. And here you've just kind of got some a volunteer out surveying for rugged old beetle in the Cotswolds as part of the Back from the Brink project. So it's literally just going out, with a torch, scanning the ground very carefully. And here you've got a black old beetle that was spotted doing one of these nighttime surveys. So it's basically as simple as that, just getting out, right conditions, and just carefully scanning the ground with a torch to look for them. The Back from the Brink project, which basically the rugged old beetle was a target species really as part of the Limestone's Living Legacy sort of sub-project. And, Jennifer Gilbert, who worked for Butterfly Conservation, she was taking volunteers out and looking for new sites for rugged old beetle. And they managed to sort of find a number of new sites across the Cotswolds, so in the Gloucestershire side in particular. But you can see the sort of the bluish dots are all the new sites really for rugged old beetles that were found from between 2018 and 2021 as part of this rugged old beetle sort of surveys really as part of the Back from the Brink project. So it does really go to show really that the species is under recorded, and it's no doubt under recorded in Wiltshire as well. So hopefully you'll find more sites for it, and find out a lot more about it on those individual sites as well as part of your surveys of this autumn and winter. And then the other option then, the great thing is that there are two ways to do things. So you don't have to just go out in the autumn and winter. You can also go out in the spring and summer as well and record old beetles, because you can look for the triangulids. So the rugged old beetle triangulids are active in the day between April and July. So they have quite a long period of activity. They are very small, so it's worth noting now they're 0.5 millimeter long, which might make you think that it's impossible to record them, but it is doable. And I really like it as a way to sort of find new populations of rugged old beetle. I certainly found new populations by just looking for the triangulids and not doing the adult surveys. And it's very useful in the sense that where you find the triangulids, you'll know then that the female must have egg laid in that location or near to that location. So it can tell you quite a lot about where the adult old beetles are actually using the site and where their sort of preferred egg laying locations are. So it can tell you quite a lot as well, which is really useful. But yeah, so though they are very small, it is possible to look for them, but you will sort of require a hand lens. You'll have to really, examine flowers really closely in order to see them. Here you've got a buttercup with a number of rugged old beetle triangulids all over them. So all the little orangey flecks really are all of those rugged old beetle triangulids. When there's just 1 or 2 triangulids on the flower, then it's far more difficult. But when you've got a nice cluster of them like this, is a lot more straightforward. But they typically find these triangulids on flowers in areas of open, short sort of grassland in a sort of more southerly aspect generally. So it's very much matching kind of where you would associate the adults really, those nice warmer locations. Dandelions seem to be especially important in April, and buttercups in May. So they're the two kind of key plants that I associate rugged old beetle triangulids with. And generally these plants are great for all other triangulids as well. But, for the rugged, dandelions and buttercups are the ones you want to really hit. I'm not really sure kind of what sort of plants they rely on more in sort of June and July, but it might be then more of your hawkbits, your hawkbeards, your cat's ear, lots of those other sort of dandelion-like plants that would be flowering more through the summer times. And they probably use a broad range of different solitary bee hosts, because they're active between April and July. So there's a large number of solitary bees that are active between that period of time as well. So they're probably not specific to one particular species or group of solitary bees. And here we've got a number of volunteers that I sort of was out with as part of a training course back, I think it was last year, the year before, in the Cotswolds. And here you've got, it's not the most, the glamorous way to do surveys, but you've got to be down on your hands and knees, basically very closely examining dandelions, buttercups, other flowering plants with a hand lens. So it's time consuming, but it is a success. We did find new populations by doing this. And we found them in areas of sites that we hadn't recorded them before and things like that. So if you do get out and do the adult surveys this autumn and winter, I would recommend then also considering going out and doing the triangulid surveys then between April and July next year as well. And I should say that the availability of flowers in spring is probably quite a key requirement for rugged old beetle populations. And what we found is that sites that have quite poor populations of rugged old beetles tend to have a lower availability of spring flowers. So when there's less flowers in spring, then there's less triangulids to be able to get onto solitary bees in order to become adult old beetles. So it does kind of make common sense, I suppose. And then it's already been like 50 minutes, so I'm just going to kind of just go through this rather quickly. But I've been going out and doing bee and wasp surveys as part of the Action for Insects project across Wiltshire this year. And as though I haven't been doing dedicated rugged old beetle surveys, I have been sort of recording rugged old beetle triangulids when I've encountered them. And this is just kind of, I haven't had time to produce proper maps, but this kind of just shows some of the locations where we've recorded rugged old beetle triangulids. So this is at Coombesit Down, so you've got your car park here. So they generally found along the footpath, so got a nice compacted ground, flowers next to there for them to get onto flowers, to get onto bees. But they found then pretty much you've got your footpath going along the top of the ridge here, and then they basically on buttercups, they were along the side of these footpaths here, right the way down to these sort of fields at the top here. And all of the triangulids were found on bulbous buttercup. They're probably not specific to bulbous buttercup, but bulbous buttercup was really, really important when I was there in May. Unfortunately, a lot of the dandelions had gone over by the time I was there, but they're probably using dandelions in April as well. But I'm sure there are lots of other locations to go and look for rugged old beetles at Coombesit Down, because it's a very big site. But this is kind of quite typical, really. You've got your footpath on the right there, and then there'll be flowers at the edge of the footpath, low growing flowers, and then the triangulids will be sort of on them. And then at Middleton Down, which was generally poor site for rugged old beetle, but had a few different spots that were recorded. Again, almost all of the records are along the footpath that basically goes, so you park down here, then there's the gate, and then you follow the path then all the way around, and they're basically along the path that goes along the bottom, again, because that's probably where more the bare ground is, that's where the more compacted soil is, so that's where the females will want to lay their eggs. But you can see they're quite widely distributed across the site, but they were very difficult to find. All the triangulids were found on creeping and bulbous buttercup when I was there in May. Again, missed the dandelions, but they were probably also found on dandelions. And then black old beetle was also recorded at the site as well. But I suppose the key issues with this site is the fact that where they wanting to egg lay on that footpath going around the bottom is very enriched. So there isn't a huge amount of flowers available. So that means the triangulids can't get onto the bees in order to, become adult old beetles. So, that's probably the biggest limiting factor to the species at this site, really, is the nutrient enrichment really along this sort of footpath that goes all the way around the bottom of the site. And then another issue then really is the fact that if there are flowers, then they had been cut as well when I was there in July. So the triangulids are still active in July. So, so if there were any present on the flowers, then they would have been removed as well. So sometimes the management can be, quite detrimental to the species, and you kind of got to get it right in order to benefit them. Markham Banks was a really, really good rugged old beetle site, and all of these different dots kind of show kind of where they've been recorded. I appreciate it's not the best map in the world, but it does kind of show you that they are very much concentrated towards the north of the site, and no rugged old beetle triangulids were found anywhere sort of further south than the middle. So yeah, the north just tends to be the best location. Here they were found on bulbous and creeping buttercup, also found black old beetle triangulids as well. And then sort of you've got the gate coming into the site here, and very much most of the rugged old beetles were found sort of towards that north section. And the reason really that they were here is that you've got these areas of bare ground. So these are created just through footpath erosion, but probably also a little bit from the cattle as well. But these areas of bare ground are ideal for egg laying for the old beetles, but also as nesting habitat for solitary bees. So the solitary bee populations are actually pretty good at Markham Banks, which then means obviously a very good rugged Old Beetle population as well. And then further south, they become a little bit more scattered. And basically the rugged Old Beetles are very much restricted to a little bit on the main path that goes down the bottom. Then you've got these steep bank, and there's a path that runs the top, around the top of Markham Banks as well. They're also along there. And then basically beyond this block of woodland, then there was no more rugged Old Beetle triangulates, largely because the site is very, very rank. So the site is becoming far too rank for rugged Old Beetles, for solitary bees. You know, there is a nesting habitat for the solitary bees. There is a nesting habitat for the rugged Old Beetle. There isn't flowers for the bees. It's just very much coarse grass. So it's very much a management issue that needs to be addressed at Markham Banks. And I realize time is really getting on. So I'll keep this very brief, but just to say that in 2019, I tried to investigate the potential hosts of rugged Old Beetle in the Cotswolds, and it's very difficult to determine what the hosts are. But if you can do species lists for individual sites, work out which bees are most common, which bees are the ones that most often visit the flowers that the triangulates are on, then you can somehow build a bit of a picture of the likely hosts of the rugged Old Beetle. And this generally suggested that there was species like the ashy mining bee in the bottom left there might be a host. The grey patch mining bee on the bottom right there might be a particularly important host as well as the number of furrow bees, things like the bronze furrow bee in the top right there, and things like the common furrow bee as well as a number of others as well. But then it's worth kind of noting really that the surveys were only undertaken in April and May, so you're only sort of working out which bees are the ones that are visiting dandelions and buttercups with the triangulates on. You know, we really need to do surveys in sort of June and July as well in order to get a full sort of complement of likely hosts as well. But it does sort of help to narrow it down a little bit. In terms of the Wiltshire sites, at Cumberset Down, they're probably using furrow bees quite a lot. They probably are using mining bees as well, but I need to really visit the sites in April when the dandelions are flowering to kind of work that out. But possible hosts at Cumberset Down be things like the bronze furrow bee, the bloomed furrow bee, the common furrow bee, the white stone furrow bee, and then the lobe-spurred furrow bee as well. So these furrow bees are the ones that generally, you know, more common on buttercups, which is what we found the triangulates on. At Middleton Down, very much the bronze furrow bee again, the common furrow bee, redback furrow bee as well could be a potential host because that has a very strong association with buttercups, as well as the lobe-spurred furrow bee as well. So, you know, the furrow bees are probably the main host really, particularly in the May sort of month when the triangulates are active. Morgan's Hill, which I haven't really taught much about, but I didn't find any triangulates there myself, but I did find one on one of the bees that I collected. So they are certainly there. But again, probably a variety of different furrow bees involved with them as well. And at Markham Banks, then is another suite of furrow bees. There's very much overlap again with the bronze furrow bee, common furrow bee tends to be a common theme across most of the sites, with a few additional species there as well. So I will be sort of doing a bit more further work on this over the coming weeks, and I'm sure Michael will be able to tell you more once I sort of finish my report and have a good think about it. In terms of recording Old Beetles, if you see Old Beetles, I'd be really appreciated if you could send us the records. The information we really need, I suppose you've all probably submitted wildlife records, but it's just the date that you saw an Old Beetle, the location, the site name, and ideally a grid reference, a 6 to 8 figure grid reference, your name as the recorder, brief description of where you saw it. So it can be quite useful to know where you saw it, if it was in a garden or, short grassland or something like that. When you saw it, the time of day or night. So if you're seeing a rugged Old Beetle in the daytime, then that's a useful thing to make a note of. Even when you're out seeing rugged Old Beetles, if you're, seeing them at 10 o'clock and you're not seeing them after 11 or something, that sort of information is quite useful as well. And then quite importantly, a photograph as well, because it'll allow then somebody to confirm your identification, whereas the county, coleopterist, or, it might be myself on iRecord or so forth. There is a dedicated Old Beetle recording scheme website, so you can go on there and it'll have a lot more information about, links to identification, There's also, a little bit of information about ecology. There's links to iRecord and how to submit records on there. So do check that out if you want a little bit more information. Bug Life, I've got an Oil Beetle identification guide, which is a really brilliant ID guide that's free to download from the Bug Life website. So I do recommend printing that out and taking it with you. Perhaps you don't need it for rugged Old Beetle surveys, but it would be useful to keep with you in spring, especially when you're seeing black and violet Old Beetles, to remember those kind of key characteristics. So do check that out. And I really appreciate if you could put your records onto iRecord, because that's the best way of really capturing all your information. And then it can be verified then by myself, and then enter the database and with all the other Old Beetle records in order to inform conservation on the ground, which is obviously a really, really important thing. And there are lots and lots of unanswered questions about rugged Old Beetle. We need to, find out really about how vegetation height affects the adults. Do they have this preference to shorter, sward grassland? Are tussocks really important? So if you're seeing them, near tussocks, on tussocks during cold weather, it'd be kind of really, useful to know that information. How do they respond to grazing? So if you have grazing on a site over the winter and is removing tussocks from one area, then do the rugged Old Beetles move across the site and respond to those tussocks? So they've got that refugia. If you're finding them in areas where there's yellow meadow ants, are you finding more in areas where there's these yellow meadow ant mounds? They tend to have higher floral diversity. That's another useful thing to find out. How do things like aspect, elevation, other environmental factors affect the distribution and abundance of rugged Old Beetles? What flowers are the trianglids using? What plant species are they using? Which ones are most important for the trianglids? What bees are the trianglids using? How is the aspect elevation affecting, the trianglids? It's lots and lots of different things you can contribute with. So it's a really good way, by doing surveys, whether it's to the adults or the trianglids, you can really contribute to our understanding of the species, which is a really great thing. So apologies, that was quite a long talk, because I talked for an hour rather than 45 minutes. But if you, have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. And if you ever want to email me with any questions or ID queries, then my email address is there, which is just liamoldsecology@gmail.com. And if you're on Twitter as well, then just follow us at Old Beetles UK as well. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Liam. That was really great. Really interesting. It was interesting that you found so many triangulins at Markham Banks, because when we were doing our surveys last year, that was where we found the most adults.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. We found at least 50, I think.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's really good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hopefully we've got a few more sites this year, different places where we can go and see if we can find some. So I've got a few plans. So
brilliant.
Is anyone got any questions for Liam? All quiet.
No, it was a good presentation. Thank you very much. I followed that really well. Very interesting, but no questions.
Thank you, Angela.
I think because you covered it all, Liam, I think the questions, we haven't got too many at the moment, but anyone, like you said, can email you with any questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, always happy to answer that. And if anyone is quite a keen photographer and wants to try and photograph bees on some of these sites to help us work out what the bee hosts are, I'm always welcome to, sort of try and identify some bee photographs as well and things like that. So, you can, if people are out in the early spring and you've got some of those nice, big, distinctive mining bees and stuff out in April and can take some pictures, and if you're unsure what they are, send them across. I'd be happy to help with that as well.
Yeah, it'd be really good to do the trianglins, because we didn't really do that last year. We just did the adults, so it'd be extra. And then it showed what they look like as well.
Yeah, that'd be really good. Yeah.
I'd just like to say to everyone, if anyone is interested in coming out with me to do some surveys, we're going to sort of start in the next couple of weeks, because we just want to sort of try and see if we can cover the range that Liam mentioned with the months, because last year we sort of started at about November time, so it'd be just quite nice to see when they start coming out and when their sort of peak adult population is. So if anyone wants to come out with me to visit some of the sites, obviously we can go to ones that are near where you live, so I can sort of match them up if you would like to email me, and I can sort of invite you when we're doing a reserve near to where you live. So there's quite a few reserves that we'll probably be going to. Obviously the ones that Liam's already mentioned and the ones that we did last year, but there's a few other sites that I quite like to investigate just to see if they're there, so that'd be quite interesting. Okay, well, if no one's got any more questions, I'd just like to thank Liam again for his time and really interesting presentation and just all the work that he's done on our reserves this year.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Michael.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll see you soon in Wiltshire. And thanks to everyone for attending the meeting. It's been good that so many people have joined in. Okay, thank you very much, everyone.
All right,
Thanks,
all.
Mike. Thanks,
Great
Liam.
talk.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks all.
Michael.
Thanks, Liam.